Welcome back, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started with session 2 of our class on grief and the Christian life. So I'd like to start our session today with another quotation to lead us into this topic we'll be talking about today. It's a quotation from the Proverbs from chapter 25, verse 20, which says, "Whoever sings songs to a heavy heart is like one who takes off a garment on a cold day, and like vinegar on soda." This is one of the verses about grief I would propose that never gets quoted in a season of grief, and yet I think it is the most helpful insight the Bible has to offer directly to the experience of meeting someone who is grieving. Now, we're going to use this as a window to enter into a discussion today on how grief is dealt with among us in the community of the church. Would you mind closing that door real quick? It's just some background noise there. So before we jump into that directly, let's take a step back and review a little bit about what we talked about last week. So we talked about the nature of grief and that it is the experience of contradictory emotions that attend a loss event. And that a loss event was the disruption of the familiar pattern. It was the disruption of the expected. That puts us into a relationship with a moment in our life where we have a lot of uncommunicated emotional communications, right? We have a lot of unexpressed emotional communications that leave us eventually pinging back and forth between a moment in our past and the attempt to avoid that same moment in the future that eventually creates the experience of ghosting our own lives, of ghosting our own present moments. As we enter into a conversation of grief in the church, I'd like to talk about this through a different metaphor, the metaphor of the iceberg of grief, which I've illustrated for you here and on your handout. Now, oftentimes, as I see it play out in the church, when someone is going through a grief event and when they are actively grieving, there tends to be resistance, unfortunately, that is met in communities of faith, specifically ones that are within cultures that don't grieve well. These two things amplify each other, and it is unfortunately the case that the church is not immune from imbibing bad narratives or bad understandings of grief, especially if they are surrounded by it, especially if all of the participants in that particular parish have been sort of brought up just imbibing these different beliefs about grief. So what this creates for us is an environment where there is resistance to the expression of grief, or any sort of negative emotion in general. And this puts us in the position of being people who become progressively, as we continue to practice a non-resolution or a non-processing of our grief, it puts us in the posture of becoming like an iceberg. We're on the surface where everything is known and visible to one another. We have this wonderfully ambiguous and yet deeply unhelpful phrase that we continue to echo to one another: "I'm fine," right? "How are you today?" "I'm fine." I have told you nothing about myself in this. What it really means is that I have actually created a phrase that repels you from asking a deeper question at this point. This is a shielding phrase that keeps you distant from me, puts up a kind of wall between you and me that prevents me from getting closer to you. Fine is an ambivalent phrase. It doesn't actually tell us very much about the person, and yet it tells us just enough to give the person a sense of, okay, I've asked, and now I can go on my way. And as people who grieve and who are having this unresolved relationship to our grief, the phrase "I'm fine" can be both an immediate relief, right? It prevents us, it gives us sort of a freedom from having to address the problem that we're actually experiencing for the moment, but it also becomes sort of self-defeating the longer we practice it, because it becomes an expectation we have for ourselves, because we keep repeating this as a kind of mantra to ourselves, and it becomes an expectation we create in our communities, right? So lots of people have asked me at one point, let's say lots of people have asked me over the course of experiencing grief, and I have responded to all of them by saying, "I'm fine." My community now expects me to be fine, because I have told them that. I expect myself to be fine because I have told so many people that, and yet Factually, I am not fine. I am not fine. Under the surface, I have an increasing amount of unresolved grief and new experiences of that kind of glom on to that that subterranean or subaquatic level here, and it continues to grow even while on the outside my I'm fine continues to endure. This creates a peril, as with any iceberg, because increasingly with our own lives and with the lives of those around us, we have increasing amounts of unresolved negative emotion that do not permit us to actually be around one another at some point. So if we have a bunch of these icebergs that are continually growing beneath the surface, eventually they bump into each other under the surface, whereas above the water, we are looking farther and farther and farther apart, and we're not quite sure why. We lose a sense for why that is. So on the top level, we have these little peaks that are bobbing in the ocean, increasingly distantly from each other, whereas under the surface, there's all this unresolved emotion that is distancing us over time. This is the reason why unresolved negative emotion in a communal space is so disastrous, because it distances us while on the surface we continue to parrot the same story, we're all fine. And we continue to have to shout that louder and louder and louder as we grow farther apart over time. Now let's return to review a bit what are some of the reasons why we continue to do this, why we continue to tolerate this vision of emotional processing. It is because we have imbibed at some level one of a few different myths about how we grieve well. So let's review them for ourselves. The first one again is don't feel bad. Right? This is any form of the phrase, it's okay, be okay, feel better. It's gonna be fine. When we talked last week, we talked in terms of death events, right? We sometimes phrase this in a sort of optimistic thinking of well, they're in a better place, which we talked about last week as really just meaning you need to get on board with this idea and stop feeling bad about it because they're in a better place now. Are you sad that they're in a better place? Yeesh.
Yeah, that's
not so good. Our second one here, replace the loss, is also very popular in a kind of consumer culture, right? Because we have the idea that everything's replaceable and generally by a newer and better model, right? Oh, you lost your iPhone? Great, there's a new one that just came out anyway. You're going to have a better one in the end anyway, right? Oh, you lost your significant other? There's plenty of fish in the sea, and we now have apps for that, right? To help you go and find them. Not so good. Replace the loss. Remember, replacing the loss actually doesn't end up resolving the negative emotions surrounding a loss event. The third one, be strong for blank. For name the person that in your head is the person you have to be strong for. You can't feel any sadness or anger or any negative emotion because you need to put on a brave front for that person, right? We talked about that as being ultimately self-defeating because, again, the longer we go unresolved in our emotional space, the more we start to ghost our present. And so the people we are allegedly strong for are the very people we end up being absent to because we have not resolved our emotional dimension.
I'm sorry, what
Yes.
do you mean by ghosting your present?
Yes, so let's review that term real quick, right? So when we have a grief event in the past that goes unresolved, what happens is we fixate on it. We think about all the ways we wish that it was different, better, or more. We kind of ask, how could I have done that different? How could they have done something different? How could we have avoided that perhaps? And the more focus we give to that thing, the more it draws our attention away from where we're at in the moment, right? But then it gets worse because what also happens is then we start to fixate on the future and an attempt to prevent the same thing from happening. And so we either are dividing our time between two moments in time. The past, where we are analyzing and reanalyzing the same event with some futility because it happened. And then we also fixate on the future, which becomes increasingly just a horizon of opportunities for the same thing to happen again. And so we fixate a lot of focus on trying to avoid that same thing from happening again. And so we end up just ping-ponging between these two moments. And in the meantime, the present moment where we're actually at, where we can actually meaningfully affect change in our life, becomes in a place where our focus is decreasing continually. And so that's what I mean by ghosting. We end up being kind of a phantom in our own present moment because all of our attention is dedicated elsewhere from where we're really at.
Over what? We have absolutely no control over anything.
Exactly, right? We need to, so the point of eventually resolving grief is so that we can re-engage the present moment again and kind of be back in the present again, which will actually enable us to actually be strong for these people. But we try to shortcut that process, unfortunately, by just kind of suppressing our grief in the name of being strong, which ends up undermining the strength we want to give to another. So, the fourth one, keep busy, right? Just stay busy, right? Go, get a hobby, get a pet, get something that'll just bide some time right here, which is connected to our fifth one, give it time. Time heals all wounds, right? We talked about how that's actually not the case when it comes to negative emotional experiences, because they just continue to refresh themselves in the brain and continue to cloud our ability to process the present moment. Time actually does not make grief go away. Grief continues to refresh itself in sometimes new and complex ways the more time goes by. And lastly, when all else fails, just don't bother anybody with your negative emotions, right? This is a bad myth about grief. Grieve alone, right? You're kind of bothering everyone right now, or you're bumming everyone out. Can you just maybe take that somewhere else? Now, generally, in a church setting especially, we wouldn't tell that to someone, right? We might say it in a really nice form, right? It's like, it seems like you need to get some space. Which can mean as much, like, oh, I think, that you need to actually process this. But what it ends up doing is it kind of gives the person who is grieving a sense of exile from their community, right? Getting some space is read like, oh, I need to stop, impacting people. I can't leave a footprint in this community. I need to, kind of absent myself so that I'm not bothering anybody with, my inconveniently negative emotions here. Grieve alone is this kind of last myth we imbibe about this. So as long as these myths are fueling our processing of grief, we will continue to have an increasingly growing grief iceberg in our lives. And now this brings us back to our discussion of the church, having reviewed those basic concepts, and brings us back to the proverb here. Now, the idea of whoever sings a song to a heavy heart is like a person who takes off a garment on a cold day. That is, the image that's being described there by the proverb is like walking up to someone on a cold day who has a nice warm coat and just saying, I'm going to take that from you right now. I'm going to just leave you colder than you were before I interacted with you. And then the second image there is like vinegar on, like baking soda, right? You dump some on it, and it's this just caustic, messy, it's an aggressive and violent chemical reaction. What the proverb is meant to express to us here is a warning in the community of faith against overly simplistic and overly quick fix approaches to grieving, to a mournful heart, to a heavy heart. And unfortunately, this is a warning that the church and all communities of faith continually need to hear. Because unfortunately, we use our understanding of the faith often as a way of kind of crushing experiences of our humanity, especially the experience of negative emotion. We try to use the faith as a kind of quick fix to get us out of having to feel anything, except positive things. So let's talk a little bit before we jump into specifically to the church. Let's talk about some of the behaviors that develop as our grief iceberg grows. Because again, as we experience continually being less present in our own moment, and as we continually experience distance from one another in community owing to all this unresolved grief, we have to find ways of coping with that. And so if we'll direct our attention to the bottom of the first page here of our handout, we'll talk now about what are called short-term energy-relieving behaviors, or using the acronym a STIRB, which I feel is a great sounding word for what we're describing here. What are STIRBs? STIRBs can be anything, really. But what they are they're temporary quick fixes to help us avoid having to confront the true source of our negative emotions. They are ways of sort of shunting off excess emotional energy that kind of wells up beyond our ability to I'm fine it to death. Okay? That's what we're talking about with STIRB. So really anything can become a STIRB. And things that are STIRBs aren't necessarily bad things of themselves, but they become detrimental to us when we use them as a replacement for having a candid and charitable treatment of our emotional lives. So as we look at these right here, we see that there's some of these that we know are sort of immediately self-defeating, right? The ones we would identify as, yeah, that's self-destructive behavior right there. That's probably not a good thing to do. But there are some on there that are otherwise, quote unquote, good things, right? So as we go through this, we look at a few of these STIRBs right here. This is just, again, a sort of sampling list here. So we have food, right? Eating. We have drugs, alcohol, smoking. Sometimes we have sex as a short-term energy relieving behavior, or in that category as well, fantasy. Romantic fantasy specifically. Work is a very popular STIRB, especially in, again, a very driven culture. Projects, getting hobbies, doing, work around the house. Cleaning is another one, right? How many times have we felt like, oh, I have something like that's in me and I don't really want to deal with it? Like, I'm going to clean my room right now. I'm anxious, or I'm sad, but I'm going to do something instead. I'm going to keep busy. So I'm going to go clean my whole room or clean my whole house. Exercise, I've seen, be one of these things where people get really into working out because they've lost, as in the immediate wake of losing someone. I knew someone who lost their father and afterward became a workout junkie. Right, that was all consuming, and the extremity of it was what clued it into being a STIRB, right? Because it was all they would talk about, all they could talk about. Every conversation was redirected back to, macros and the ideal protein levels, and their on and off days, and when their cheat days were, and it was just like, this is the whole narrative right now, all of a sudden, and it's like, that's suspicious. Let's take a look at that. It's not bad to exercise, but it's bad to exercise if really what I'm doing is drowning this part of me that's screaming out for help, right? Sleeping is another one. This is another way of kind of keeping busy, right, or occupying the time. I'm just going to sleep it off, right? I'm going to just be unconscious. Gambling behaviors sometimes arise from this, a kind of a way of creating an artificial stress to distract myself from the stress I'm actually feeling. Social media is a very big one, right? This attends that kind of fantasy element, right? I'm going to get out of the world that I'm actually in by going into a world that is kind of pretend and curated, because that's a nicer, cleaner world that doesn't have any of the junk that I can't control over here in this world. Entertainment is another one of these, right? I'm going to go and I'm going to watch an entire season of something on Netflix. I'm going to go to the movies a lot just so that I can kind of have something that shuts the voices out for a while. Another one that I mentioned last week for myself was studying and intellectual pursuits, right? This one also sounds really good on the surface, right? It's like, oh, look how studious, he's such a good student, right? I had a professor who actually called me out on this one time when I was at Torrey. And we were in my final exam, which is a sort of verbal interview, a sort of verbal interrogation, right? And I aced the exam, and she goes, you did really well this semester. And I said, thank you, right? And she goes, that concerns me, and I'm like, because I had experienced in that semester a devastating personal loss, and she had known about it. She goes, it really concerns me that you did well this semester. That's probably not a good thing. And I was like, oh no, someone has seen through my relieving behavior here. But I'm grateful for that, because that always stuck with me that, I can use this thing as a way of coping with my negative emotional life, right? Shopping and retail therapy is another big one, right? Amazon is a great, go-to, a great best friend who will never ask me any uncomfortable questions about it. He'll just say, hey, I have a bunch of things you might like. Right? And it's like, oh, I want to think about that. That's cool. All right. But then also storytelling is another one. Sometimes we get to the person who wants to control the conversation with people they're around. This is a way we manipulate our communities to stay away from the thing we actually don't want to deal with. So there's a kind of person you might know, or you yourself might be this, where in your community they're always sort of driving where the direction of the conversation goes. And it's never towards anything candid or uncomfortable about them, right? It's always like, I got the latest thing for you, and it's this all-absorbing thing. And generally, they're very compelling in this too, right? It's like, oh, they always got a great story to tell. And it's like, but weirdly enough, it never circles back around to anything that has to do with any frailty on their part, right? And we do this for ourselves too, when we're in the middle of one of these events and we're feeling kind of shaky. someone asks us like, oh, what have you been up to lately? It's like, well, let me tell you all the things that I've been doing lately. And then we talk without ceasing for 30 straight minutes. Like, well, I got to go now. Bye. And we peace out. So a helpful thing is to ask yourself, where do you fit into your stir? Like in your mind right now, it would be helpful to say, like, okay, what do I tend to drift toward? In the same way that it's helpful to kind of identify your top 1 to 3 myths, the ones that you tell yourself the most often. It's also helpful for you to kind of hone in on what are my kind of top 3 stirs? What are the top 3 ones that I tend to go to, right? Now, these things, these behaviors are not necessarily bad things in themselves. Some of them are of themselves self-destructive, but some of them, in the right context, are fine. But when we're using them as a way of denying our emotional existence, this becomes dangerous. And so I'd like to add one more to the list that I didn't put there, but there's the kind of Christianizing of any one of these that also works that way. I've known people that get really into like volunteering, right? All of a sudden they're just, building houses all the time, right? In the wake of this thing. Or they're going on mission trips. This was a big one when I was at Biola, and I mentioned it last week, right? There was always a mission trip team you could join, and I had people that compulsively went on short-term missions trips, right? Now, the hard thing about those ones, the ones we kind of baptize, right? The kind of baptized workaholism of the person who endlessly volunteers at the church or does service projects in the community or who's going on short-term missions trips or is going and volunteering at the soup kitchen. The problem with this is it's harder to call out. As with any sort of form of bad emotional processing that happens in the church. Because it looks good. And like, how do we go about saying to someone, I think you should volunteer less? Right? I think you should help the poor less. That doesn't sound great when we say it to someone, and yet it may be the thing that someone really needs to hear. Because we can use even the items of the church or the services of the church or the ministries of the church as a way of denying our humanity, as a way of denying our basic experience of emotion. And that makes them something that is detrimental to us and ultimately detrimental to the people we want to serve. The kind of minister who engages in a baptized form of workaholism is the kind of person that ultimately will hurt somehow their community. Because they'll either explode some way, they'll implode some way, and then they leave a trail of disaster in their wake. But again, it's hard. Especially if we're in community with that person. Because, again, the tip of the iceberg on the top looks really good. But the more we begin to identify these lower level behaviors and the things that may be driving them, it might eventually give us the courage to ask, like, how are you really doing? You're doing some great things, but how are you feeling right now? And at one point, we all need to be asked that. Because, again, most of us have this experience of not really resolving our grief. So let's turn to how we start to resolve our grief, how we begin to complete this. So if we've identified in ourselves places in our life where we have maybe ineffective or unhealthy relationships to our own experiences of loss and grief, then we need to ask the question, how do we begin to heal? How do we begin to articulate those unexpressed emotional communications? How do we begin to identify where in our life grief has touched us the most? And so we'll talk here about how we process experiences just in general, right? So this sort of chain of things on the top row here, this fourfold action right here. We have the stimulus, the thing that sort of in our environment that arises, right? Any sort of thing that happens in the environment around us or even happens within us, right? Something happens. It's a thing that happens. What follows it is a recognition of the stimulus, right? You're registering it, which is the thought that attends it. This is the second part right here. So I have something stimulates me from either outside or within, and then a thought goes to identify what that thing is, and then starts to go to work on analyzing it and seeing what kind of thing it is, right? We want to register, is it a friendly thing? Is it an enemy? Is it a threat? Is it something to be curious about? Is it something to avoid? We start to go to work on how to think about it. With that comes an emotional response as well, because we are integrated beings, right? So if we register something as a threat, we have the emotional experience of like concern or worry or anxiety pops up within us. And with that, we then sort of, all these things coalesce into a response, into an action that attends it. And this is how we kind of go about processing our lives. We kind of go about through this process. We're continually having stimuli. We're continually thinking about what kind of things are around us. Is this a safe environment? I'm feeling a lot of things with that thought of whether or not I should stay here or whether I should go. It's accessing previous emotional experiences that I've had, so that I need to know like how does this interact with my own history? How does this interact with where I want my life to go? Especially if we have a spiritual sense, then we're bringing that into the matter as well, and we're evaluating things continually according to the concepts of the faith and also moral categories. And all of this is kind of conspiring together to tell us, how should I act right now? How should I act in this moment? What should I do? Now, if somewhere in our thinking process we've adopted these myths about grief, when we experience something, when we experience a loss event, when there's the stimulus of a loss event, these myths go to work in that thought-feeling stage, and then that impacts how we then go about what to do in light of that loss event. So let's say we have adopted the keep busy myth. If I experience a loss, I'm immediately going to register that, and then my mind and my heart are going to go to work on it. Right? We're going to be like, okay, how should I think and feel about this? Well, how I should think and feel about this is governed by this mythology right here. That's my prevailing belief system about this. So what am I going to do as an action? I'm going to respond to that loss event by going and finding something to get busy with. And meanwhile, that unresolved and uncommunicated negative emotion is going to just sit in me. So what we need to do is we need to kind of hone in on identifying where we've adopted bad mythology. We need to identify where in our lives these unresolved grief events have happened, and then we need to do something different, which ends up helping us to break the cycle of all these sort of the bad cycles that we may have acquired throughout our lives. And so what we want to do is we start with installing a new action in our life, and this impacts our emotional and cognitive life, and then helps us over time to impact our underlying belief systems as well. We can kind of act our way into a new feeling. But only if we're doing so in a way that actually aligns with how we're put together. We can't trade one bad myth for another bad myth, right? So if I've adopted the keep busy myth, it's not going to do me any good to just jump over here to the don't feel bad myth, right? I actually have to come back to an understanding of what will help me to grieve in a healthy way, and then start doing things in line with that. And eventually this experience of being absent from my present moment will be diminished as we're able to bring our focus back in, as we complete our understanding and express the things we need to express about the past, which then changes our relationship again to the future. The future gets to be a kind of more open field of good and cautious opportunities, not just a uniformly bad experience waiting to happen. So we're talking about habit formation here, in other words, which is something we talk a lot about here at the church, and it's something that's very much in line with a Christian understanding of formation. We are habituated into behaviors that then shape us in our character. And so when we're talking about habit formation, we need to start by becoming aware of the need for a new action, which I hope by this point in these classes, we've identified some ways that we may have adopted a bad mythology of grief and may need to install a new action in our lives. I hope that's not terribly profound, but sometimes it is, and it's okay if it is, because we've all, again, been touched by this in some way. The second one is discovering and being taught the steps or components of the new action in their proper order, right? If we're eventually going to cut against bad mythology, we need to replace it with a positive thing. We need to replace it with a true mythology. We need to replace it with a true belief system that then begins to actually work towards our healing. And then we need to practice step 2 of doing that new action in its proper order with the right components, like 30 to 40 times. Just continually doing that and practicing it again and again until it becomes our new belief system, until it becomes our new way of living life. And so this brings us, when it comes to grief, to the idea of what we call grief recovery. And so immediately when we talk about grief recovery, we're talking about a new action that we do when we experience the stimulus of a grief event, either one we're currently experiencing or one we've experienced in the past. This is how we begin to actually articulate and complete the things that remain unresolved and broken within us. So the new action we're talking about ultimately with grief recovery is, at the emotional level, forgiveness. Now, what that means at the emotional level is something a little bit different from how we talk about it at the spiritual level, right? When we're talking about forgiveness at the spiritual level, we're talking about the practice of entrusting to God the ultimate judgment of things and the ultimate healing of things in the judgment and resurrection that Jesus will bring. It is an act of entrusting something to the work of God that he is doing throughout all time. But at the emotional level, this becomes a little bit more visceral. And so here's what it means. I've given us a definition here. At the emotional level, forgiveness means saying goodbye to the hope for a different or better yesterday. Identifying exactly what that is, what that different or better vision of yesterday was, and saying a meaningful goodbye to it. This is a new action that doesn't cause us to run away from that moment, but brings us eventually into the company of that moment again, helps us to know it for what it is and to eventually say goodbye to it. It is an action that leads us to cease the emotional experience of resentment towards an offender by an acknowledgement that communicates what was done or left undone. Now, I immediately want to qualify this by saying this is not an acknowledgement that what was done was right. The fact of what happened is the fact of what happened. We cannot change what happened, whatever that thing is for us. What we can do is take a meaningful step in changing our emotional relationship to it so that it no longer drives us, but rather we are able to be deliberate and responsive to that moment or to that person. For many reasons, the person who committed the offense or the person we lost cannot be directly communicated with. And this makes grief recovery a little bit tricky because sometimes the person we need to say an uncommunicated emotional thing to is gone. Sometimes they're still very present, but unable to hear what we need to say to them. For any number of reasons, changing that person is implausible. But what the good news is that we can still take meaningful steps to complete our emotional relationship to that broken moment, to that loss event, even if they don't change. And there's hope in that. Because while that person may have a long journey of going through whatever they are going through, maybe they're gone, maybe they're still here, maybe they're in a place to hear, maybe they're not, that doesn't mean we can't take a meaningful step towards healing. We can't take many meaningful steps towards healing. We can. And that's what grief recovery is all about. So what grief recovery involves is taking a big picture look at the grief events that have shaped our emotional lives. It involves identifying in that big picture the different relationships that have been ruptured because of the loss events in our lives. And it involves coming to terms with what are the uncommunicated things at the emotional level that remain unsaid in those relationships. The things we wish were different, better, or more in those relationships. And ultimately, in light of all of that identification, it means articulating a way of saying goodbye to those things, which at the emotional level is that forgiveness, which liberates us. It frees the heart to again be present in its own life. So let's talk about this in the Christian life, because we are talking about this within the context of the church. So this idea of grief recovery, this idea of how we actually process grief, is something that is very harmonious to the Christian faith. So I want to talk about how grief fits into the Christian faith. Christians have always properly understood grief to be a reality. They have never turned a blind eye to it in their better moments. Sometimes they have, but that is to their detriment, and that is to step away from the fullness of the faith. The fullness of the Christian faith has always been, if anything, brutally honest about the reality of grief and the reality of loss, because at the heart of the Christian faith is an understanding that the fall of humanity and its attending brokenness is a reality that cannot be denied. The fall happened. It's not a little story that, was useful for a time. It is a fact of our existence. We have all inherited, by virtue of being born, a share in this thing we call the fall. It runs through each of us. It runs among us. It is one of the things we all have in common with one another, is that we all partake of this mystery called the fall, this mystery of brokenness that manifests in evil, manifests in death, manifests in frailty, manifests in all manner of brokenness. Attending that, Christians have never denied the problem of death as a needful interlocutor with their hope for resurrection. We alluded to this last week, but as Christians who confess in our creed every week, we believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. We have to remember, as the people who profess that there is no solution if there is no problem. If death is not a problem, then the resurrection is not a solution to the problem. If we profess the hope of resurrection, we acknowledge at the same time, with the same vigor, the problem that death presents to us, being as it is the consequence of the fall. To deny death does not give us a stronger hope in resurrection. To deny death ends up undermining a realistic hope in the resurrection. We see this in the life of Jesus, which is why during Holy Week we spend such time focusing on Good Friday. Because the fact of Good Friday is the precondition to the glory of Easter. If we skip past Good Friday, it undermines our understanding of why Easter is so important. As Christians, we can't get away from either of these facts. We are aghast at the brokenness of death as a consequence of the fall. And we look with an active and vigorous hope to the glory of resurrection. To lose one is to lose both. The church, theologically, we have to understand as a meeting place of both of these things, a candid acknowledgement of death, and a place that is the home of the hope of resurrection. They both live here. They both live with us in the sanctuary. When we go there, both meet us there. We're confronted by both continually. It's the thing that makes meaningful our whole liturgy, our whole way of being. Because ultimately, that's what we all want. We want the resurrection. We don't want stirbs. Stirbs are a shortcut to what we really want from the resurrection that can't deliver on what they promise. So, acknowledging that, we don't want to be those people who take off someone's coat on a cold day. We don't want to be vinegar on soda. We don't want to be people who say, forget about your problems, just focus on the hope. Just have hope instead, which is again a Christian form of this. Don't feel bad or feel better. Just have hope. Just have faith. There is no hope or faith without an acknowledgement of what has gone wrong. These are only real solutions because this is a real problem. So practically, what does that mean for us? As Christians, we have an especial responsibility to acknowledge and take responsibility for our grief. To deny grief makes us less Christian, because Christianity it looks with a straight eye on both of these things. So that means for us that if we try to suppress the reality of grief, we're actually taking a step away from the hope of resurrection. We're actually stepping away from Christian faithfulness. It calls us back to it. It calls us to examine it, to look robustly at it, not to shy away from it. It also stresses to us the importance of allowing others to grieve in our midst without trying to fix it. When the person comes in who's grieving, and I'll say this, I myself have been that person in this place. I have come into the back of the church crying, just to sit there and be sad. And one of the things that kept me here originally was the fact that no one tried to fix it. Whereas in so many other places they did. Because the problem that brought me in on my knees couldn't be fixed quickly. It couldn't really be fixed. It was a pervasive and continuous grief. Had someone come along and say, well, here's 10 steps to just, being more hopeful. That would have been so deeply alienating that it would have driven me into an exile from this place. I wouldn't have come back. I was ready not to come back. Right? So, Christians have an especial responsibility in their not denying of grief to not try to quickly fix grief. And when we're talking about grief recovery, we're not talking about fixing grief, right? In the way we think about fixing other things. We're not denying the fact of what went wrong, but we also are not consenting to that being the whole of reality. We acknowledge that in the ultimate horizon of healing is resurrection, what we all really want. But we understand in the meantime we have images of resurrection that can be meaningfully present in our midst. That by the grace of God, we actually can experience forms of healing that remind us of the ultimate healing that is to come. So when we're talking about grief recovery, we're not talking about the just ignoring or just sort of suppressing of grief again. The facts of our grief events will still be there in our biography. Our relationship to them will change meaningfully and in a healthy way, Lord willing. But ultimately, that healing will be something that causes us to look with greater hope at the resurrection to come. So that means for us, we have to be a community of people who are able to tolerate negative emotion in our midst. Not just grief, but anger. Also worry. These things we don't want to skip past with quick fixes, but the thing we will allow to say, yes, this is a home for those who acknowledge the fall, because this is a home for those who acknowledge and confess the resurrection. The third practical thing for us as a church is to remember the importance of uniting our experience of grief and the whole of our communal emotional life to the practice of our prayer, to our life of prayer. This is the thing that gives us a unique voice in all of this. This isn't to the skipping past of dealing with our emotions. But as we work through grief recovery, what we've talked about up above, it turns us again back to the highest things. It turns us again back to the ultimate things. Because the more we realize what it looks like to make some meaningful steps in recovering from our grief and completing those things and articulating what is really true about us, it turns us with a renewed sense towards our actual longing for what we want to be healed in the resurrection. It doesn't turn, it reorients our whole life of prayer away from being prayers for things that enable this, to praying for the actual resurrection that we all long for. Because so long as we remain unresolved in our grief, and so long as we persist in these myths about grief, our prayers about our grief will be ways of trying to get God to enable this for us. We'll say, Lord, just help me take my mind off things. Lord, please, please bring me another one of these. When the Lord knows, who sees the core of every heart, that's not actually perhaps going to heal us. But as we abandon bad mythology, and as we again return to the truth of grief and true ways of dealing with grief, it helps us to cease to pray for things that aid in a bad mythology about grief. It helps us again return to praying within reality, to pray within the reality of who we actually are, who we have been, what has actually happened, because that alone is the place where the Lord wants to come, bringing the healing of resurrection. It is only in us as we actually are, not in ourselves as we would like ourselves to be, whether positively or negatively. It is only in who we really are that the Lord will meet us. But if we are so beset with looking for him to meet us in our phantom myths about who we really are, we will be disappointed, because that's not where he wants us to be. He wants to draw us back to the truth, because only there that we can be actually free, not driven by the horror of the fall, but looking with an honest eye at it while being pulled along by the hope of resurrection. So, I'll close with a few next steps that I might suggest for all of us. So, one book I would encourage everyone to read if they have not read it is a book called The Grief Recovery Handbook by a guy named Russell Friedman and his colleague John James. This has been the most helpful book on grief I have ever read. I recommend it to you all. It is a $10 book on Amazon. I recommend going and getting it and reading through at least the first 8 chapters of it, which are the ideas that a lot of the ideas we've discussed in better form or more articulate form. And then the remaining chapters have to do with our second step here, which is what's called the grief recovery method. So one of the things I like to offer the parish is what's called the grief recovery method. It was created by an organization called the Grief Recovery Institute, which is an international organization of people who think about grief studies. And they offer training to pastor types and counselor types and teacher types for those who want to learn how to help people meaningfully interact and work through their grief. So I'm happy to offer that to anyone in the parish who's interested in that. Okay. But within that too, that's a good meeting place to talk about our grief. But then I can also make recommendations if it seems like there are other things we might need to do as well. So what I would also recommend everybody to do is also to give some thought to getting into some spiritual direction as well, because that meaningfully affects our relationship to grief as well. And then also I would encourage everyone, if you're feeling a particularly intense form of grief, to reach out and get help. We can make recommendations for licensed therapists. We have the resources at the church where we can make recommendations of people in our community who are professionals of psychology. Sometimes, and I know that's been the case for me, I've needed that at different seasons of life. Sometimes we have things that happen that just we need to get help with at the medical or psychological and the therapeutic level. That's also there. So I always recommend this kind of 4-prong approach right here. Let's educate ourselves. This book will help you to educate yourself on the kind of basic landscape of grief. The second one is actually start to deal with your own grief. But if it turns out that there's more than just that kind of ordinary grief, that kind of common grief that's within you, then there's opportunities for spiritual direction, and there's also opportunities for licensed therapy as well that we can make recommendations for. So the point is there are meaningful steps for all of us to take in coming to a healthier relationship to our emotional grief. And as a church, we have a special responsibility to be a place that it is safe to grieve. But what that means for us is not to just say that it's safe to grieve, but to be the kind of people who, through our own experience of working through our grief, become the kind of people around whom it is safe to grieve. If we want to become a church that is helpful to the grieving, it starts with each of us. We cannot give what we have not received. And so the more we cultivate emotional health, the more we will be an emotionally healthy community. That's something that the bishop is passionate about, something he's directed us all to consider. And this is one more way that we can uphold that charge and be a place for those who are broken by the fall to come in and find rest for their souls. So with that, I'd like to conclude my content portion and open it up to any Q&A for the remaining 10 minutes. Yes?
Well, I see God grieving a lot in the scriptures.
Yes.
And never apologizing for it.
Yeah.
And I wonder, do you think the Father grieved over the loss of his son when he died on the cross?
You know, it's so the question is, and I've been asked to repeat the questions for those who are watching on the video, because no, that's fine. I'm gonna just repeat your question. So yeah, and so it's okay. It's an excellent question. So the question being, do we think that God the Father grieves over the loss of the Son? The question is difficult because it's difficult to attribute our emotional life to God the Father. What we can do, however, what I think we should do is look to Jesus. So let's look at what Jesus does, right? Jesus is the image of the invisible God, right? So let's look at Jesus because that's who we're always continually instructed to look back to. So what does Jesus do? Jesus grieves. Jesus grieves robustly. Jesus grieves even though he knows what's ahead. Jesus grieves in the full knowledge of what has been. Jesus, let's take, for example, the moment in John's Gospel where his friend Lazarus dies. The scene is striking because Jesus comes on this scene where Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and in the community of Bethany, there's an ongoing act of communal mourning. In that culture, you would have people sometimes who were even professionally hired to continue mourning while everyone who was directly related to the person had gotten tired and was resting, right? Because you had this ongoing communal observance of mourning for those who had been lost, okay? Jesus comes along, and the language of the gospel distinguishes him immediately from the crowd, because it's the crowd that's kind of going through the observance of mourning for the loss of Lazarus. But it talks about Jesus' interior state in this one of these rare moments in the gospel. It highlights what is Jesus really feeling right now. It says he was grievously moved in his basically like sometimes the King James translates it in his bowels, right? And that's what it means is it's a sort of an experience of grief that is deeply felt in the in your organs almost. It is this visceral experience of grief that Jesus is experiencing, which is not a performative kind of grief. It's meant to set it apart from the grief that's happening in the kind of observance of grieving that's happening around him. So we could read that moment to say, while Jesus walks in and there are people who are going through the motions of grief, Jesus himself feels an authentic grief. He feels a grief that moves him in his viscera, right? In the core of his body. That is the way that Jesus grieves. That's significant to us because it's not Jesus going through the motions, which sometimes we make the sometimes even implicit mistake of thinking. We think that on the cross, Jesus is kind of going through the motions of, oh yeah, look at me dying for you. He's actually dying, right? This isn't an act. This isn't a piece of performance art. This is real stuff. When he's grieving, he's not just saying like, oh yes, death is sad. He's viscerally moved, bowed over by it, right? We've all had that experience of something that hits us at the emotional level so powerfully that it like just hits that vasovagal nerve and just grips it with both hands, right? To the point where we actually seize up in our core. That's the verb. This is not performative grief. This is real, visceral, embodied grief. So if we look at Jesus, there's a place for this in the life of Christ. If it was, and Jesus is doing that because he's recognizing the horror of death and how it breaks this whole community apart. He's looking at its effects in Mary and Martha, one of whom likes to stay busy, right? And the other one who comes straight to him and says, why weren't you here? This is a grief event for Christ. And that gives us a hope that, this isn't antithetical to those who share in the life of Christ. This is something that if our Lord saw fit to experience even this part of our humanity, it's part of us, for one. But also, whatever Jesus assumes of our humanity, that he also redeems. Anything that Jesus brings to himself in our humanity is redeemed by that bringing into him. So even grief can be redeemed, and that's the hope of that moment. It shows us an image of what is to come for everybody, of resurrection. The revival of Lazarus is an image of the ultimate resurrection to come. But it doesn't mean the grief isn't real. Jesus knew what he was about to do, to raise Lazarus from the dead. And he still grieved. These things are not enemies of each other.
I guess I'm just like, I understand that, but I'm thinking more like on the cross because I have also a Reformed background, which is very cerebral.
Yes.
And I have trouble connecting the emotions of Jesus to the Father.
Yeah.
So I see Jesus on the cross grieving, and I'm wondering, what's the Father doing? Just turning his face?
Probably not. It's difficult to put language to what if any, the emotional experience of God the Father is like. It's just difficult to say that, to put words to that, right? Because we have to kind of stack metaphors on metaphors to get there, and it creates a kind of teetering tower of language that sometimes is less helpful than it's worth. But what we can say is that if the experience of this visceral emotion is something that was assumed by Christ in assuming our humanity, this is something that God the Trinity is bringing into himself, and is something that God the Trinity is actively present with and in. So that gives us something of an answer to your question, I think, which is, no, it doesn't seem like God the Father is at all uncaring. And Jesus himself teaches us this continually. Lay all your burdens on him, because your Father in heaven loves you and knows what you need, and is present with you in that need. He doesn't turn a blind eye. And you're right, that kind of cerebral vision doesn't quite get at the intensity of the passion at all. So I would say, if you want an experience of this, come to the Good Friday liturgy during Holy Week. This for me has been the most clarifying experience of what the passion means, is coming and experiencing the Good Friday liturgy. So I would call us all back to that. But no, God the Father loves you and is not at all indifferent to the suffering of any one of his children. God never, as Pope Francis recently said, God never denies his paternity, even in the darkest moments. He always acts as a father. Ruth?
Maybe I'm just trying to conceptualize in a way that I think about it, maybe what you said too, that's hard to imagine how God would think about things, but is there a way to think about it scripturally? Like, I mean, we can't understand the mind of God who can have every emotion at the same time, can think about the way he knows about the fall and resurrection at the same time. So it's, to me, that's something I can make peace of all the suffering in the world at the same time, knowing that God can handle how, the way he...
It's a helpful thing, and I think if we're trying to tie together what God's experience of grief is like with what our experience of grief is like, we have to look at Jesus. We have to continually meditate on Jesus, because he is the union of divinity and humanity. And so if we want to see the image of the invisible God, we look to Jesus. If we want to see the icon of our humanity, we look to Jesus. If we want to see the union of those two things and how God is present with humanity, God is with us, we look to Jesus, who is God with us, right?
God's way of saying, I know.
Yes,
exactly.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, he is not at all indifferent. And that's one of Jesus' main points that he hammers continually home. God is not indifferent to the suffering of his children.
And don't you think also God is not indifferent to our anger? Because a lot of times in our
Yes.
grief, we are like, there's just so many things we're angry at.
Yeah.
And it can be directed towards God.
Yeah.
And in his mercy, he's like, it's okay.
Yeah. The experience of anger and how that could be its own class and should be its own class, right? Because it's one of those other negative emotions that, at least on the surface of it, it's difficult to know what to do with, right? Because there's a form of it that is perilous to us and endangers our soul, and there's a form of it that is just a sane reaction to certain stimuli, right? The same way that grief is. Grief is, again, if we remember, the sane person's response to loss. Anger is oftentimes a sane response to injustice, the sane emotional response to injustice. Now, where it goes from that point of origin is oftentimes not great, and that's why the scriptures caution us so consistently against it.
And that's a problem with unresolved grief, because that anger can it becomes unconscious, and it goes out sideways to it goes all around. And I think thinking too, for me, that grief has been a very long process, and I find it's like, oh, I'm such a downer. So I'm the first person inside, like, to not be a downer.
Yeah.
You
just deal with it yourself.
Because, it's hard for people to deal with,
Yeah.
So
it really is.
Yeah. So that anger can become.
And anger works very similarly, right? It accrues.
Yeah. It accrues.
It doesn't go away. One of the most helpful images I've ever heard this. It was a book called the Anger Book, and it's a helpful book on this topic. But it talks about how like grief, anger accrues. They calls it the anger slush fund, right? And so it's like that, and it's just kind of this accruing kind of like background account that we have, and it doesn't go away. In fact, it starts compounding with interest the more things get added to it. And so like grief, it's something that has to be dealt with candidly. And dealt with honestly, because otherwise, time doesn't heal anger any more than time heals grief. Time heals the intensity of the moment, perhaps, but it doesn't. But the underlying things that go on with anger, like grief, are they persist.
But is anger connected to grief, like Kubler-Ross's old view on all that, or is it?
Yeah, some like in the event, like with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her great book on death and dying, which is where we get the idea of the stages of grief, or the stages of grief. That really has less to do with what we've been talking about, and I'm glad you brought it up because it's something that isn't immediately helpful for people who are going through sort of what we'll call ordinary normal grief. Well, it also has to do with the reality of confronting your own imminent death, which radically alters your psychology, right? When you're given a sort of certain vision of imminent, decease, that shifts your whole mindset, and Kubler-Ross deals with that primarily. But one of the problems is that Kubler-Ross's model of the 5 stages of grief isn't immediately applicable. Isn't really applicable at all. Like even anything more than abstractly to the process of normal grief, ordinary grief. And so sometimes we have this expectation, right? Where like I experience an ordinary loss event, and I'm experiencing just normal, sort of normal grief, normal negative emotion, and then I expect it to go through this sort of schema of stages, and it doesn't. Because and so we have this, and then we compound the problem because rather than actually taking meaningful grief recovery steps, we expect it to just kind of deal with itself as we passively watch this emotion go through the 5 stages. And when it doesn't, it creates an enhanced sense of worry and anxiety in us because we're like, I'm not going through the 5 stages like I ought to. And then we get worried about it, or what it does is it sort of disenfranchises us from our own grief again by saying, I must be abnormal. I must be abnormal because I'm not going through the 5 stages, And it's not an immediately applicable thing to just the kind of conventional grief, which is why we narrowed our study at the beginning here. When we're talking about death and dying, especially when we're the one dying, then we start to move in a different direction with the Kubler-Ross's work. Yeah, but this is more describing the kind of everyday grief. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just sitting here kind of listening in that regard and thinking about what may be like another grief or whatever, which is that you get over it.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I don't know, but I'm not sure you do. I think you maybe learn to live with the event.
You work around it.
In a peaceful way, but it's not the same as being over it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing I think people say, right?
Yeah.
Get over it, or you should be getting over
Right.
it by
Yeah.
now. So it's sort
Move
of
on.
linearity,
Yeah.
right? Where we're going to start here and we're going to go through some steps in order, and then we will be done.
Right.
I'm not sure that is.
Now, here it's a great question. So, there seems like there should be a middle point between to kind of echo the question again. What is the middle point between just get over it and just living with all of these grief icebergs floating around in our life, right? And I would propose that's what grief recovery is. it's an acknowledgement of what has been, so it's not a get over it, right? It acknowledges and looks candidly and honestly at it. But at the same time, it also acknowledges that something that has happened has shaped us in a meaningful way, but that we can become sort of more deliberate and responsive to it rather than being reactive to it continually. Because the thing about unresolved grief is the more we ignore it, the more we become unaware of it, the more it's still doing stuff to us, even though we may not be aware of where the sources of that influence are coming from anymore. So then we start to get into sort of kind of compounded experiences of grief or complex grief, where we're experiencing sort of symptoms of something that have cause in something we've ignored so long we've effectively forgotten, right? We've taught ourselves to suppress our sort of relationship to this event so much that it's still influencing us in increasingly bizarre ways. But we lose sight of where that originally started to come from. Yeah.
I guess maybe I'm thinking about like the continuing influence, and you said something about acknowledging that you've been shaped by it, which is not the same as getting over, right? Just acknowledging, and that's what I mean by living with it, that it is integrated, the event and the results are integrated into your, so
that's right.
You're not over it so much as you are just.
It's become a meaningful part of you again. It's been reintegrated. I like that language of reintegration. Yeah.
Like the metabolization.
Yeah. It's not sitting as kind of like just sort of unresolved, a loose end. It's sort of woven back in again. Yes.
Okay, so I have a neighbor friend who lives 2 or 3 streets away from me, and within the last year, her son killed himself. Okay. And then I heard about it through the grapevine. So I've seen her since then, and I haven't said anything. Okay, so it's hard for them, and it's hard for me, and and then you don't. This is a hard thing. How do you want to? I love this lady. She's a nice gal, and I feel silly that I didn't say something. Right when I saw her, I heard about your son, and I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
And I still want to say that to her, but I guess I feel like. Now, why didn't I say it when I first saw her? You know?
I would say it's never too late.
Okay. Next time I see her.
Because again, the grief continues.
Yeah.
But establishing strengthening the relationship. Now, it's important what we say, right? Because again, what we started with is the person who sings a song to a sorrowful heart, right, is not a help to that heart. And so it's important to be careful about what we say in those moments. The whole idea, sometimes it can be even it can be hard to even say I'm so sorry for that, even though you are, right? But what that does sometimes is it communicates to a person who's grieving it sort of puts on them your own emotional experience of this. I am feeling sorrowful about this. While we mean to communicate empathy, it just means like, oh my gosh, another person that's just kind of throwing their emotions on me, like, and projecting onto me, like and that'll be like sort of alienating. Is saying, that's terribly sad, and I can't imagine what you must be going through right now. But I wanted to make the connection because I care about you. That communicates without laying our own, sort of discomfort with grief on that person. And it actually communicates what I think we really want to say in that case, which is to say, you're not alone. And what happened was real and sorrowful. But your grief is your grief. And I can't appropriate it by saying, I know what you're going through. And so it gives them the dignity of having that emotional response to the loss event, which is also real response to a real event, while also maintaining the connection and saying, you have people around you. Yeah, without laying expectation to say like, open up now, which for any number of reasons we might not be able to, right? So it gives dignity to all of this and gives a fullness of a full recognition of humanity to your neighbor, without appropriating and without projecting, which then maintains relationship without burdening it with, again, any of this stuff right here, without compounding it by introducing our own discomfort with negative emotion into the situation. So, but yeah, that's just a long-term long-term grief, right there, a terrible grief. So, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. And I want to thank you all for joining me on this journey to kind of walk through our understanding of grief. I hope that all of you have come away with something. If anyone would like to follow up at all, please just email me through my email address at the church, hayden@stmatthewsnewport.com. And I would love to get together with anyone who wants to talk a little more about their relationship to grief. But otherwise, thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Yeah.